Good evening. It's such a pleasure to have you all here, even if I can't see you. We are celebrating for many different reasons tonight, and I'm glad you're part of that. We are opening the exhibition Why Draw? 500 Years of Drawings and Watercolors, a show that for the first time in a long time surveys a collection that we believe is the oldest collection of drawings in the country, the oldest public collections of drawings in the country. And what we are demonstrating to you with the exhibition is that resource that curators, directors, donors, many members of the Bowdoin community have been building for more than 200 years is very much alive today and is a repository of ideas and techniques and tools that all of us should know about as we are learning about the world around us and communicating with each other. Drawing has very, very important roles to play, not only in the artist's studio, but also in all of our lives. And I think that this exhibition tries to make the case for that very, creatively, as is appropriate for such a topic, by presenting about 150 works that span 500 years of drawings, starting with the work from the studio of Raphael that was probably used in the education of his assistants, to works that were just created not so long ago. So I'm very happy in a moment to announce today's speaker. As you are listening to the talk, at any moment, remind yourself that you'll be rewarded for listening with a glass of wine. No, I'm just kidding. And the reception is going to follow in an hour or so at the Museum of Art. And then please take a look at the exhibition as well. Today, we are honored to have Natalie Frank here, who, like few others, is making a case for drawing as a powerful medium to engage wide audiences with big themes of our lives and of big bodies of knowledge that can come down to us for history. So we really couldn't think of a better artist to make the case for drawing from a contemporary perspective and that is informed by the long history of drawings that we are presenting in the show. Natalie Frank is from Texas originally. She earned her MFA at the Columbia University School of the Arts and has a BA from Yale University. She was the recipient of a Fulbright scholarship that took her to the National Academy of Fine Arts in Oslo in Norway, and she also studied in 1997 and 1999 at the Slade School in London. It's interesting that Natalie has been able to match this international education with international success of her work. A recent exhibition was dedicated to her thoughtful, provocative, and really amazing drawings related to Grimm's fairy tales, a show that was exhibited to great acclaim. Many, many reviews were published at the Drawing Center in New York, traveled to the Blanton Museum of Art, and other places. You will find her work in collections of many distinguished museums, including the Art Institute of the Chicago, Brooklyn Museum of Art, the Pennsylvania Academy of Art, the Whitney Museum of Art, Yale University, and many other museums as well. It is, I think, fitting to point out that 5 absolutely gorgeous pastel and gouache works are installed currently in the exhibition Why Draw? And for those of you who haven't seen that exhibition, it is the final wall of the installation that really energizes the show with this display of 5 illustrations of one particular fairy tale of the Brothers Grimm. And before we share that show with you, it is only fitting to ask Natalie how she came up with that work and how to think about it. I also would like to point out that her work as an illustrator of sometimes obscure, sometimes difficult texts and tales is continuing. She published the Grimm's fairy tales with Damiani in 2015, I believe, 2015. And this May, June, she's publishing with Princeton University Press The Sorcerer's Apprentice, a collection of magical tales. We won't have those the newest books, because they're not published yet, available to you, but as we are going over to the reception you will find at the bookshop the Grimm's fairy tales that Natalie, of course, is happy to sign. Let's welcome Natalie Frank for a talk this afternoon. Thank you.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here. I've never been to Maine, and I'm really was just blown away by the campus and the museum, and thank you, Frank and Anne, wherever you are, and Joachim, and of course, Bryson Brody, who so kindly supported this work and gifted the work to the museum. So I thought today I would sort of speak about drawing and show you a bit of drawing as it's been interwoven through my practice from beginning really in graduate school at Columbia up until the present. I included a few drawings from the recent Sorcerer's Apprentice book and would love to talk about a few new projects. I came to art really through drawing. So for me, I think I was 12 years old, and my mother, who trained as an artist but wasn't afforded the luxury of actually becoming an artist, she was incredibly supportive. And so she started taking me when I was about 12 to nude figure drawing classes in Texas. And of course, this was like a secret cabal held in a woman's garage, me and like 12 65-year-old women drawing from the nude model, and I had to be accompanied because I was so young. And the story begins with me, I was wrapped immediately. Also, the male model posed about 2 inches from my head, which everyone thought was hilarious. But I was just drawn to the idea, of course, of storytelling, but doing it through people and their bodies. And the art teacher began by showing me works by Katakalvitz and Beckmann and Gross and Dix and a lot of the Weimar artists. And I would take these drawings back to my high school in Dallas, Texas, which was a private high school, and would talk to my art teacher about them. And the head of the school caught wind of this. And just within the little drawing, area of the classroom, and began a war to have me kicked out of my high school for being a pornographer. So I'm happy to be here today as a successful pornographer. So that began my foray into drawing, and this went back and forth for about 6 years throughout high school. And eventually he conceded that I could make nude self-portraits and images of nude women, but no nude men. So I came to Columbia and I was drawing, but I had never made a sort of concerted body of drawings. And so I began making sketches for paintings. So that's what this image is. And these really are sort of the precursors to the Grimm's fairy tales, though they were my first real body of drawings. So these were sketches, gouache and chalk pastel, very loose, as you can see. They're taped and kind of haphazard for large-scale oil paintings. And so some of the characters are fictional. To me, they represent archetypes that I'm interested in. Often they represent scenes that I want to watch as a voyeur, sort of played out on the page. This was a sort of carnival-esque temptress. And so at this time, I was also obviously making paintings. And I think using, on the right, you can see the bare canvas, but using the paint a lot like I would a drawing. And so throughout the past probably 10, 12 years, I've really been going back and forth in terms of painting and drawing. And Joachim and I were talking about the difference between what makes a drawing and something that looks like a painting on paper also a drawing. And so for me, those distinctions have never been valuable or necessary. So I've always worked very quickly and I think used paint like I would in a drawing. So I was working from photographs of models, friends, family members, whoever would sit for me, my hairdresser, photograph them, light them, dress them, and then put them together in these allegorical scenes. And you know, thinking back to artists like Käthe Kollwitz or Max Beckmann, the ideas which I think are consistent through generations of what we're interested in. We're interested in talking about our bodies, ourselves, our environments, the dramas that play out around us. This is my uncle, Robert, who's blind, who I think of sort of as a self-portrait, though I think of many of the paintings and drawings as self-portraits. And I should say, if anyone has a question, you can just holler at me during the talk. This was a group of portraits I did. I spent some time in Rwanda and was really interested in the ways that women have rebuilt the country. And I think, you know, working in the studio can feel a bit isolating and frustrating, and I think there's a constant desire for me to try to find portraits that resonate in the real world. And so I went there and photographed survivors, women survivors throughout society, judges, healthcare workers, mothers, and made these large-scale portraits that were then shown with oral histories. And this is a 21-foot painting based on the writings of Hannah Arendt about World War II, but it was made for an exhibition in Berlin. And this was my first attempt at printmaking. So this was I think 3 or 4 color lithograph, which I really, really enjoyed because I wasn't really making bodies of drawings at this point. This was sort of the closest thing I found to combining the act of drawing on a stone with painting. And I liked the mediation also of when you draw something and then it becomes something else because it's put through another process. So this was about 2010, and I started to make drawings. And this was right before I began the Grimm series. And this is a couple in the interior. The man or the woman, maybe it's 2 women, is part gopher, kind of animal, which strangely happens a lot in fairy tales, which is probably why I was drawn to them. So painting, this I really thought of as this was a sort of autopsy, a painting that used paint like drawing, especially here's these kind of figures that were drawn over the painting. And I guess I included these. I wanted to show a sort of variety of ways that I'm interested in using paint, because I really do think of them as, strangely, drawings with paint. So this was a couple years ago. I sort of had been feeling I wanted to begin to make drawings, but I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to make them about. And I think, like the paintings, they were moving back and forth, tearing between abstraction and figuration. Another couple. And I did the Grimm's fairy tales, which are in the gallery on this paper, which you can see is really rough. It's a 300-pound Arche watercolor paper. And I really enjoyed the way it took materials, so the gouache would kind of seep into the surface and the chalk really lies on the top because it's so rough. And I liked that combination and interplay between surface and depth. I think in a similar way that the figures are often disappearing or disintegrating, which is generally how I feel about bodies and being in the world. So at this point, I started to really use painting and collage. and think of these strokes like drawing strokes, and they were kind of violating the edges, some of the edges of the paintings. This had an inset window, so this was a huge panel with collaged elements, enamel, oil, and then this was inset about 5 or 6 inches, and it was an actual window that went through the painting. And this was a collage drawing. 2 animals in the forest, trading berries. And this starts the Grimm's work. So that's just sort of an idea of what I was doing before this body of work. And I started this body of work in about 2011. And I was visiting an artist, a very good artist friend of mine, Paula Rigo, who's a Portuguese artist who lives in London. And we had met when I was at Yale, so it was 10, 12 years we've been in touch. And I was in her studio, and she said to me, we were looking at her, she's a drawer, also makes prints, and she said, you should really look at the Grimm's fairy tales. She said, I'm 80 years old, I'm not gonna get around to illustrating them, but you should. So I said, okay. So I came home and I ordered the first book I found off of Amazon, which was Jack Zipes, the great fairy tale scholar, who's a retired professor of fairy tales from Minnesota, who lives in Minnesota. And his was the first book I found. And I started to read the stories and was just immediately captivated. And something really unusual happened. And I think it was a combination of the fairy tales and also sitting down to concertedly create a body of drawings, which I had never done, which was this acute synesthesia. So when I would read the stories, images fully colored would immediately pop into mind. So it was really like I would read through the stories, notate paragraphs and what scenes I thought were compelling, and the colors and images were just all there related to the language. And the drawing was a really kind of fascinating, fun way to figure out or recreate the sounds of the paragraphs, if that makes any sense. So I contacted Jack Zipes. I said, I really want to do this body of work. It started a bit casually. I was just drawing for fun, as one does, the fairy tales. And at a certain point, when Claire Gilman from the Drawing Center, the curator, we began to talk about a show, I said, I really want to do a book, that this has always been a dream of mine, to put together an artist's book. And so I contacted Jack Zipes, and we went through and chose the fairy tales that I enjoyed and that he thought were most historically relevant. So I ended up illustrating 36 of them, which is the largest collection of the tales that have been illustrated, of the unsanitized versions. And so they range from 1812 to 1857. And they were later sanitized by one of the Grimm's brothers. But what I really found compelling about the stories is, when I began to read more about their history, is that they all began as women's oral tales. And so the Brothers Grimm were philologists, and they were interested in language. And they had these women from all over Germany come to their home and tell them the stories. And then they recorded them. And then they changed them for poetics. But fundamentally, these were women's tales that were passed down through the generations. So they represented women's anxieties, fears, desires, things that they couldn't necessarily speak out loud because of controls of the church and the state. So we put together the book, and I began to make the drawings with an eye towards these sort of feminist reinterpretations of the stories. I focused primarily on women and the female characters, both the evil ones. In this is a set called All Fur, which is donkey skin originally, which is one of the Perrault tales, and which is an earlier group of stories. And it's one of the 3 stories, like the Maiden Without Hands, which is in the gallery, about incest, which was a very real problem for women at the time. And so this is the father who assumes a donkey head, and the evil stepmother who, the mother, when she dies, says, "When I die, I want you to marry someone as blonde and beautiful as I am." So naturally, the king decides to marry his daughter here, and she has to go into hiding. And she lives in a tree, which was a common occurrence for women, and has to wear a coat of every animal in the kingdom, and says, "If you can make this coat for me, I'll agree to marry you," thinking her father can't do it, but he does. And so she has to go into permanent exile. And so it was fun to read the stories, think about how I wanted to represent this. I realized that I don't know a lot about animals, and I would have to Google, what does a squirrel paw look like? Or what does a pig snout look like? When you really set to begin to draw something, you realize how little you actually know about it. And that's a portrait of my father I put in the tree. And that is the final image. And that's the maiden who has to blacken her face and work as a chambermaid. And then eventually, like all oral tales, this one is a subset of the Cinderella story. So she marries the prince and lives happily ever after. And this was Cinderella. So the stories they're just, I found them to be hilarious, though quite dark, and definitely not for children. A lot of sexuality, violence, like I said, incest, cannibalization, real realities of life at the time for women, but sort of couched in these metaphors and tales that also seem very simple somehow. The language is so beautiful, but are incredibly complex, and everything, all of the symbols in the stories mean something in their historical time. For instance, birds, as in the Cinderella story, this is the scene where the evil stepmother says, "You can go to the ball if you can gather up all the lentil seeds," that she scatters. And so Cinderella calls in all the birds. And birds represented a helper of women at the time because of a device that gynecologists wore while inspecting women during their exams that had two lenses and a long beak-like nose. Thus became storks and birds as helpers of women. So I read a lot of Jack's work, of course, Maria Tatar and Marina Warner, who also writes with an emphasis on women. This is the second Cinderella, the evil stepdaughters here, Cinderella in the golden gown, and I decided to decapitate the prince. I liked that the male characters were really not that relevant to most of the stories, so they were minimized, would be a generous word. That's her hiding in a tree. And there's the poor little prince, who's kind of not a lap dog, but more like a lap parrot here, and her birds who are sort of going into her hair. And it was important for me, as I chose to represent women, and I wanted to represent them across the spectrum, that they not be just traditional heroines, our idea of beautiful princesses. That was quite the opposite of what I wanted to do, giving, through drawing, nuance to representations of women. Thus her beak-like nose. And this is the marriage scene when she marries the prince, and in the original unsanitized version, the stepsisters cut off their toes to try to fit in a slipper. Oh, and then have their eyes pecked out by birds, which is going on right there. This is one of my favorite drawings. It's The Ungrateful Son. It's a small tale, and so some of the tales, like the one in the gallery, I chose to represent with 5 drawings. This was a very short tale. It was about a paragraph, and it was about a boy, a son who did not feed his father, and so he was cursed to live with a toad on his head, and if he didn't feed the toad like he didn't feed his father, it would eat his face. So I gave him a border of flies. I was looking at a lot of old drawings of illuminated manuscripts, of old fairy tale drawings, and throughout the body of work, because there were a couple hundred drawings at the end between the marginalia and the full page drawings. I wanted to use some of these tropes of the history of drawing. So these are the borders. I gave him fly borders. And this is the juniper tree. So it's fun because unlike in painting, where I would never paint a picture of death riding a miniature horse, I felt like I could get away with a lot in drawing. Drawing as a practice allows me to do very different things than what I can do in painting or paper making or print making. I think the interplay on the surface between what's painted, even these light kind of ghost remnants, and then to the fact that you're able to really negate what you've painted with the actual drawing of the pastel is very interesting to me. It happens a lot. I do it a lot in the figures themselves. And I think the heightened drama, the kind of carnivalesque feeling is also something that I feel I can get away with in drawing, especially the color, which I love, color. This is the scene in the juniper tree when the evil stepmother who's cooking the little boy feeds the body parts to the father. It's a great story. And then in the end, she gets her comeuppance. Everyone gets a gift, and she gets a millstone on her head. So I thought, again, why not make her like an evil peacock with her rump in the air, with this horrible Ensor-like mask on her face. And so I included a few images from the book, which was really fun because I had no idea how drawings became books or drawings became images that then became books. And this book was really wonderful to put together. The publisher gave me complete freedom and said, it's due by this date, do whatever you want. So we made a fully illustrated, high-colored book, and then I got to invite my dream people to contribute. So we had Linda Nochlin wrote an essay about my Little Red Riding Hood drawings, and also sent an erotic poem, which we did not include in the book. And then I did a conversation with Julie Taymor, and Claire Gilman also wrote an essay, and then Jack Sipes wrote the introduction. And of course, we used his translations for the tales. So I included a few of these. So this was the idea for the cover, which then became that. And I worked with a really wonderful designer out of Canada, Marion Banshees, who our aesthetic, I think, which was incredibly Baroque and dark, really fit together nicely. So we had about a year and a half for me to do all the drawings and for us to create the book. And so we really just made a list and worked top to end, creating all of so everything in the book was drawn. So this was the front end papers. These were all the heroines lifting up their arms, and these were all the villains taking a bow. This is the title page. And this was a collaboration. I wanted a drawing to represent the collaboration Marion and I, the designer, had together, because it was such a special, it was really a highlight of making the book. And so she did and she's known for her typography and hand lettering. So she did all of the hand lettering, and I did the animal border. So that was our title page. And this gives you an idea of what the book looks like. So each of the 36 tales had its own title page, and then border drawing. And then the border drawing was mirrored. And we also printed the book. Drawing was so fundamental to this project, obviously, and to the book, that we decided to print everything on the image of drawing paper. So it's a smooth paper, but we printed the textured arché paper. So this is an example of what it looks like. So really, it was just fully drawn. And it was a joy to work on. And it was, like I said, the first time I had ever tried to make a body of drawings and really fell in love with drawing. And I should say that I think because I started young, working from life and always from the model, which they sort of beat out of me in graduate school, I never trusted that I could draw from imagination. And that was, I think, the biggest gift that this book and this body of drawings gave to me, was rediscovering that, yes, I did have an imagination and I could work from my imagination, and that could sustain the narrative. And I think it was incredibly helpful to have the stories as a baseline to go from. But I think I didn't draw for so long because when you begin to draw from life, you feel that you always need to be drawing from something. And so it was really, I think, learning that I could just look inwards and then draw was a wonderful benefit of doing this book. So at the same time, I was doing painting shows. So that project the drawings spanned 4 years. All the marginalia, which was a couple hundred pages, and the finishing of the drawings was about 1.5 years. And at that time, I was having painting shows and I was drawing. And what was really interesting at the time was I discovered just randomly at a doctor's appointment that I did not have depth perception, which is really hilarious since everyone in my family are in medicine. And I've worn bifocals since I was 2. And so it was midway through the Grimms that this doctor diagnosed my lack of stereoscopic vision, which I guess quite a few artists like Picasso and Calder and Rembrandt have suffered from. And so when they told me I could do years of eye therapy, I thought, it's okay. If it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me. So midway through the Grimms, the drawings begin to change, and they put a lens on my bifocals that gave me about 3 to 5 feet of depth perception, which obviously changed my world. And after I stopped crying, it was a revelatory way to see the world. And so the drawings in the Grimms became more three-dimensional, the borders became more three-dimensional. And then in my other studio work, I started to experiment with depth. So this was a wooden screen that was collaged on paper, and you can't obviously tell because it's flat, which is pretty much what everything looks like to me. There's about 1 inch of space here. And then the paintings, which, had begun as almost life scenes, moved into this sculptural dimension. And parts like this window slid up and down. You could peg it at different holes and it would reveal different parts of the painting. So the work was changing. And then about this time I started to make handmade paper, which is really the closest thing I found that bridges drawing and painting for me. And I was working with Dieudonné. It's a fascinating process. I can tell you more about it later, but it's, little bits of pigmented linen or cotton that you basically use like paint, but it's so delicate, it's like painting with a wet tissue on a wet tissue. And everything is wet and draining and self-leveling, and you can mix different media with the pigmented pulp and achieve different layers of transparency. But there was a sort of freshness and looseness, which I had never felt I was able to achieve in the painting, that I was now able to get in a sort of painting drawing manner. And so I made quite a few of these, and these are a few of these. I did a lot of women and dogs. I think I looked back at the history of portrait painting and thought, why not include dogs instead of men with women as their companions? So these were that. So it's all paper. And then this takes me to the book that's coming out in May with Princeton, The Sorcerer's Apprentice. And Jack and I had such a great time working on the Grimms, and we did fun programming, and it was a real pleasure to work with him. And so he asked if I wanted to illustrate his next book, which is The Sorcerer's Apprentice. So it's 6 years of tales that he's gathered from all over the world, over 13 languages, 2,000 years of literature, tracing this tale type of the Sorcerer's Apprentice, that within it has 2 variants of the rebellious apprentice and the humiliated apprentice. and Disney Fantasia being one bastardization, of course, of the humiliated apprentice, but the rebellious apprentice actually being more common in literature, from Ovid to the Brothers Grimm to Hermann Hesse. And so I worked with Princeton, the art department, and they were just fantastic. They kind of gave me free rein, though they said black and white only. So this was the drawing for the cover of the book. And this, obviously, the sorcerer and the young apprentice. But the idea is share knowledge and power, and the apprentice will then not have to vanquish or kill the sorcerer. And that withholding those things only leads to a continual cycle of violence, which is what occurs between the sorcerer and apprentice in the final scenes. And it's remarkable that as you read through 2,000 years of this story, there's so little derivation between the arc of the stories. So this was gouache and chalk pastel, though it was on a very smooth paper. They didn't want any paper texture, which made it very, very difficult to do. And that ended up being the cover, back cover, and flaps, which were the only color elements. And we tried to achieve the drawing texture here and also in the lettering. And then these were some of the black and white drawings. There are, I think, 15 or 20 black and white drawings throughout the book, and then little drawings also that run throughout the book. And I actually wrote, if anyone reads Modern Painters, I wrote an essay about the Sorcerer's Apprentice, these drawings, making the drawings for the book, and the connections with our current political situation. So, strangely down to the actual phrasing The Apprentice as a TV show, which the parallels of authoritarianism are striking. So this is one of the final scenes when the animals, they chase, the sorcerer and apprentice transform into different animals and chase each other. And again, I tended to focus on the images of women, though these tales, interestingly, revolve only around men, and women make one appearance at the end of the tales. And like the Grimm's tales, like all folk and fairy tales, these also began as women's oral tales. But after Christianity, the idea of shape-shifting women became too threatening, and so all of the female characters became men. And in the Grimm's tales, I think one thing that I really loved was the transformation between human, especially woman, and animal, and the idea of the power and freedom that afforded, and the idea of mobility, both socially in terms of gender, sexuality, that kind of transformation affords. So this is an Indian tale about a little boy who embodies a tiger, and when the tiger is killed, the little boy is killed. And it's a deeply allegorical short tale. And this is one of the Krabat tales out of Eastern Europe, where the sorcerer in the end transforms into a swan after he dies, and so this is his funeral. And I'm just always thinking about art history, and there's art historical images, and there's a beautiful Courbet in the show, and I was thinking about his burial at Ornans, and I've always wanted to put a grave in the front of a little painting. So, and in terms of these, I don't know, they're paintings on paper, they're drawings on paper, they're, I guess, whatever you want to call them. And then I threw in some recent work. I'm getting ready to have a show in June with Rona Hoffman in Chicago. And it'll be a pairing of life-size portraits of ballet dancers and dominatrices that I've been photographing from life. The ballet dancers, friends who have danced with ABT and the New York City Ballet, and then I've gone deep undercover into the dominatrix scene in New York, photographing in dungeons. So this is about 6.5 feet, and a dancer with maybe her older future self behind her. So this has been really interesting, I think, but thinking back to the, what brought me into drawing and painting, the idea of storytelling through the body, and narrative and theatrical constructions. Both groups of dominatrices and dancers, both high and low, public and private, embody this. So I'll show these just quickly. Dancers, dominatrix. And then this is the next book I'm doing, which are on French feminist fairy tales. And this is her name is Madame Delnoy. It's her tales. They've never been illustrated. She's 16th, 17th century. And I'll be working with Jack. He will translate a couple of new tales. It'll be probably a short collection, 250 pages, maybe 5 of her tales. They're quite long, but they're incredibly wry, over the top, colorful, a lot of supernatural characters, and of course women are the central concern. So this was a proposal of each page will be illustrated so that the drawings fit the text. So that is one of the next projects, and then I'll also be working on set and costume design for a new ballet production based on fairy tales with the Austin Ballet. I've never done anything like that, and now with my new depth perception, I'm excited to conquer. So that's all, and I think we have a few minutes for questions. Thank you. Oh. Yes, hi.
I'd like to go back to your passing reference to synesthesia.
Mm-hmm.
Tales, being captivated by the Grimm's tales, and you felt you were hearing the sound of a paragraph. And you must be aware of musicians and even non-musicians who associate colors with pitch. So would you just expand on a little bit the sound? You said, if it makes sense.
Yeah.
It does to me if I make the connection with pitch and colors, but would you go further with your thought?
I mean, I thought I had always had synesthesia because numbers and letters always appear colored to me in colors, but it wasn't until I began to read the Grimms, and I've never had that experience with literature before, where I felt the images come about in my mind, but I also, the way the paragraphs read, I could almost feel texture and sound at the same time. It's so hard to explain. It's like sound, texture, and color are all interwoven. And when I just read the sentences, I get an overwhelming feeling like you would when you feel like you have a fever. It just comes over you and you feel a color. Or I don't know, it happened with these, it's happening with these Madame Delnoy tales, but less so than with the Grimm's fairy tales. But I just get a sense of what color the drawing should be, how much patterning should be in it, how big the characters should be, just a general feeling of what it should look like based on the sounds of the sentences. Strange, but true. Yeah. Yes, in the back. I think it's both, but what I think is so compelling about the Grimms and fairy tales in general, but the Grimms really, the brothers really amended them for poetics and shortened them and stripped them, almost like George Saunders does in his work, where everything is pulled out and it's just what's essential. And so the sense and the sounds are the same purpose, it seems, in the fairy tales. Yep.
The drawings that you were doing in black and white for the Sorcerer's Apprentice, were those ink and wash or?
Gouache, black and titanium and zinc white, and they printed the book in grayscale, so you lost the nuance of like cold and warm, black and white, but three pigments. And I use the Turner gouache, which is the highest pigmented. It's a Japanese gouache, the highest pigmented gouache available.
Okay, that was my quick question.
Okay.
My other question was, I noticed through a number of different works that you showed us today, there seemed like there were quite a few instances where the eyes were sort of hyper real, and then there was an overlay of more abstracted, sort of painterly, loose drawing, almost like there was a hidden hyper real image underneath, mostly with eyes. And I'm curious just to know a little more about your why.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's, for me, I mean, eyes are the way in. They're a way to locate the viewer in the picture because it's a shared entry point, obviously, between the viewer looking into the picture. But I've always had a conflicted feeling about the body. And I think what you said about layering, it's almost like something was drawn over something that was hyper-real. It's almost like a guilt or a negation of two things. I think the deep desire to represent the body in its entirety, and the other, because I've had, not traditional, but I've done a lot of life drawing, and that's been an important part of my practice for me, that it's almost a distancing device from that kind of representation, because I am interested and compelled by abstraction and creating using my hand, almost like I do in drawings, but I'm always taken back to real rendering or representational renderings of the figure. So I think it's a way to combine the two, but oftentimes with work that feels like it's trying to combine two poles, you can get a little lost. And for me, the eyes pin the image down and locate it somewhere concrete. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi.
So I'd like to know more about how you thought about kind of doing a feminist reading of this work in visual terms, and I'm really interested in how rich like your use of color is and texture, and how maybe that's kind of like, I want to say kind of a queering of the stories, because we've seen so many sort of sort of like precious depictions of these fairy tales everywhere. And I'm really interested in how your work is like really, beautiful and like captivating, but it's also disturbing.
Thank you.
I know.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it. I want to combine I want to combine many disparate elements, or what we think of as disparate elements, but show that they're really not that different. And I think the representations, especially of women, have been so superficial throughout, whether it's fairy tales, ballet dancers, or dominatrices, or art, figurative work especially, that to complicate things gives whoever you're talking about humanity, and that was what I wanted to do. And so I wanted to picture women in the tales that were evil, and women chopping up their children, and the beautiful princesses, but I found it all hilarious and contemporary and just a way to humanize the characters, which we haven't had. I mean, women, being able to vote, being allowed in the life room. And women have been kept out for such a long part of our history that it seems like that was the way to try to complicate things. Yeah. In the back? Hi.
Hi, thank
Hi.
you so much for coming today.
Thank you.
Really great to have you here. Going off of Emily's question, she was asking about females in representation. I was wondering how your own experience as a woman artist has shaped your career, and what role you think that your gender has played in that.
Wow, that's a big question.
Yeah, sorry. I'm in a printmaking class, and we tend to like to ask that same general question, no matter what the speaker's gender is.
Which class are you in?
Printmaking.
Okay.
2 with my professors.
Okay. Well, I don't know what it's like to be other than what I am, but I certainly think when I started out looking at art, there was a reason someone like Kata Kolvitz resonated with me. She was the first woman to use a lot of her own autobiography to represent, for instance, sexual violence or complicated sexuality. She wasn't the first woman, but that seemed, I think, growing up in a part of the United States that I felt was very conservative and had very staid gender roles, that art was a way for me to access powerful women. So yes, I'm a woman. I was a young woman. I was drawn towards other representations of women. I've had incredible, mostly women mentors, which I can't say enough about, that if you can find one or be one, that's really can transform one's life. Paula Rigo, Linda Nochlin being 2, but I've been able to, I guess, be around strong women of all types, like in the Grimm, some evil and some divine. I think it's a struggle to much more for women to make work and have it not be perceived as autobiographical or personal. I've always tried to make work that's personal but also distanced in a way so that it doesn't feel too accessible, too didactic, or too vulnerable. But maybe I'm earnest but not that earnest. But I think that's a bigger liability for women. I notice men, when they come to the studio, even before the dominatrix paintings, want to know why I'm painting what I'm painting, and they want to get to the bottom of why I have complicated ideas of what women are like. That doesn't always feel respectful. So, I mean, I could speak to that at length, but I think it's an interesting time because it feels like Joachim and I were talking about this earlier, the camps in the art world, or the camps of artists and critics and writers and curators and who's talking about art and looking at art, everything has expanded. So for this, it's a really wonderful time to, I think, be a woman and be in the arts and be able to engage, and it feels like it's really opening. Though, of course, representation of women in the art world is still pathetic. But hopefully that is changing. Does that answer enough? Okay, thank you.
Natalie, thank you so
Hi,
much for
thank
your
you.
talk and for engaging in this fabulous conversation. I wondered if you could speak a little bit about the role of collaboration in your process. It's sort of exciting to think about the way in which your drawing offers an interpretation of tales that have been sort of told over generations, and it sort of suggests a collaboration with your co-author in the present, but also these historical layers of pushing against or in tandem with other people. And I would love if you could comment on that.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you. That's such a nice question. I never thought about collaboration because it was always me in the studio working alone. And I think having started out at a time when, as a young woman, being exposed to a lot in the art world through Columbia, through the market, through this general time, I was always reticent to go outside of myself. I just wanted to be left alone and make my work. And it's taken me some years, I think, and maturity to find value and added value in the idea of collaboration. And starting with Jack and Marion, who really do what they do and allow me to do what I do. And I find that when we come together, you know, for instance, for the Grimm's book, every day, I would do the drawings, Marion would place them, and she'd send me an image that night, just because our time was so tight. And so we saw the book coming together in real time. And it was a joy to work with people who really knew what they were doing and knew their field, and we somehow could discover this common ground where we could come together. The same with the paper making, which is done with a master paper maker in the studio who helps with materials and, you know, putting the base sheets down and teaches you about the process. And it's interesting because more and more I find, and with the ballet and moving forward with books, that this idea of collaboration is really compelling. But to your point, I mean, working with feeling the echoes of these voices through 200, 300, 1,000, 2,000 years of literature. I've always felt that when I go to museums and I look at paintings, but in a quieter way. And I'm always thinking about Courbet or Tiepolo or Titian or Velázquez. But to be able to work with primary source material that actually embodies those voices is really, really thrilling. And to locate them in the, you know, in the now. So, oh.
Sorry, I just wanted to follow up on the printmaking students' question a little more.
Okay.
You talked about including or drawing somewhat on your biography, but also trying to distance yourself somewhat. And you made a comment on the portrait of your uncle that you also thought of it as a self-portrait. And I just wondered if you could expand on how that you're thinking about that a little further.
Yeah, it's because he doesn't realize how he looks, obviously, to other people, it feels like he is the perfect portrait of a raw interior made exterior, which is how I feel all the time. But then, you know, it's like people see tough, aggressive paintings and they meet me and they're like, oh, you're so sweet. But that's, to me, that's how I feel, is that interior made exterior. And I guess that's what I want the work to be. And that's how I want it to represent me. And so I think most of the figures in the work, I choose to draw them or paint them the way I do because they are representations of how I feel. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much. That was just wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Natalie. And please come over to the Art Museum for our reception now. Thanks.